Well, then why don't we just go right into our next guest, who I think will appreciate you being fired up. That is Layan Fuleihan, who's the education director at the People's Forum, an editor at 1804 Books, and an organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition, joining us once again to check in on the global uprising for Gaza and Palestine. Layan, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me. Always great to be here.
Well, pleasure is all ours. And let me start here. I woke up this morning and I was greeted by an interesting headline in Politico. Vice President Kamala Harris urges White House. I don't even remember the rest of it, but it was like basically how Kamala Harris is urging Joe Biden to speak more compassionately about Palestinians. But it's obvious that there's a lot of leaking going on in Washington, D.C. to the media by the Biden administration and individuals in the Biden administration to try to make it seem as if they're not really on the same page with Benjamin Netanyahu and the entire Israeli leadership vis-a-vis the genocide of Gaza. I wonder how you evaluate both the obvious reasons why they want to distance themselves, which is anger in the United States, but also how you evaluate their actual complicity despite their words.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that these the tone switch over the past couple of days, the attempt, like you said, to distance themselves from Netanyahu is really just exposing that they're having a PR crisis right now. The State Department went over the heads of Congress essentially and approved more millions of dollars of military aid over to Israel. The complicity is still very much concrete. It's still very much there. They're still very much backing this genocidal assault on the Palestinian people, but they really are very uncomfortable with the isolation on both the world stage and domestically that it's bringing about. So I think that what we're seeing is an attempt to say, hey, we're not fully backing this. Hey, we did say to be careful about civilians. It's not changing, in a sense, the material basis for that support and that complicitness. And in fact, we can't deny the major role the United States has played in orchestrating this genocidal assault. It doesn't change that at all. I think this is an attempt to sort of appease the discontent, the dissent, the uprisings that they have on their hands. Just yesterday, staffers of the White House staged a protest in front of the White House. Biden's own staffers said, we don't approve of what you've been doing. We want a ceasefire. It's been echoed by the millions over the past 2 months across the country. Actions are only becoming more frequent, and people are actually gaining the skills to be doing these actions. And people are becoming better organizers. They're happening more quickly. So I think that Biden and his administration, including Kamala Harris, are in a very uncomfortable position. They don't want to be uncomfortable. They would like to continue going on as usual, supporting Israel the way they've been supporting Israel, but basically Netanyahu has backed them into a corner, and they don't have an exit strategy right now. So these I see as attempts to try to convince the general public that there's some sort of moral standing that the White House has right now, but it doesn't seem that people are really being convinced.
Well, looks like we might have lost Rania here, but I will ask you another question I have here. Let me pull this up, though, because I want to get this right, Layan, but it's just interesting polling that sort of speaks to this very issue. The most recent Economist YouGov poll asked people, do they want to increase, decrease, or maintain the same military aid to Israel? And the plurality is for decreasing military aid to Israel. Now, I have to say, even I was surprised about that. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of opposition, but maybe there was some other time in the past this was true, but it seems almost unprecedented to have a plurality of people in the United States of America saying send less military aid to Israel. And of the clear majority, it's either send less or keep it the same. I mean, so it does feel that we're seeing something of a change. I don't want to say a sea change, but something of a change towards how this issue is seen by the majority of Americans.
I totally agree. I think this is unprecedented. And it's exposing something about the way the system works that is going to be very difficult for the general public to forget. We have, on the one hand, bipartisan support for Israel. There's very little calls, both on either side of the major parties, for any sort of concrete change in U.S. support for Israel. But we also now are seeing bipartisan, I want to say beyond bipartisan, we're seeing broad support for an end to this kind of support, a ceasefire. We're seeing broad calls on across the political spectrum for an end, in particular right now, and I think we should be clear about that. In particular, right now, for an end to U.S. support for the genocidal war right now. This, in a sense, is outlining the completely different interests that the White House has, no matter which party they're in, with the interests of the general public. And it's very demonstrative. And I think that for this to be happening around the issue of Palestine is unprecedented. I also think it is unprecedented, the level of uh, violence that the Israeli state, it's not unprecedented, the level of violence that the Israeli state is committing against the Palestinian people, but the scale, the shock that it's producing on the world stage, the massive uh, massacring of Palestinian people, children, families, essential infrastructure, is, you cannot deny the impact that that has on the human consciousness. And when you have a political class that is serving only profit and imperial agendas, and then you have people who are trying to see the world and understand it and are trying to make their own decisions about what's right and wrong, you're going to see that those interests are fundamentally different. And I think that's what's being demonstrated right now.
You know, one other thing I just want to check in on, and I think that is real, is obviously these things, so much of what's happening in terms of public opinion is being driven by the horrible images we're seeing, but a lot of it is being driven by the activism that has been happening on the ground that has been bringing the issue, right in front of people's faces constantly every single day. I mean, where are we now? I mean, I think obviously we've seen many, many weeks, but are we seeing a continuation of this momentum?
Definitely. So we've been seeing an escalation, an intensification of the number, the type, the level of participation in mass mobilizations. And we need to really recognize the fact that participating in these kinds of mass mobilizations is in itself educational. People are transformed by by participating in this. It's something that we've talked about before on the show, that we hoped that the call to shut it down it's a diffuse call, but one with very clear objectives. We do want people to understand the way in which U.S. society is backing fully the Zionist regime and the colonial project in Israel. And people are going to be making lots of connections. They suddenly become committed now to the Palestinian cause beyond, in many cases, beyond just calling for a ceasefire. And so in the past weeks, past week alone, I can't actually tell you the number of different actions that were taken in New York City alone, where I'm based. We had after the global strike that was called by many different sectors of Palestinian society, and that was the response was, in fact, quite global. There was a day of multiple actions in New York City. We had a large volunteer meeting where there were almost 400 people, I actually can't count them all, who were present in person, asking what can we do next. And as a result, in every neighborhood of New York City, there's been a speak out, a moment where people come together. They are organized, they are unorganized, they know each other, they don't know each other, but they're coming together for this common cause, and they're educating on street corners. That can't be overestimated, the impact of this. And it's the first time in a long time that people are not only committing to coming out and being on the streets, but they're committing to educating their community. And that's having a huge impact. We're seeing this in many different manifestations across the United States, where it's extremely significant. The population in the United States has been subjected to a propaganda campaign over the past decades that makes it very difficult to even have any idea of what's going on in Palestine, that's based in reality, that's based in some sort of objective truth. And despite that, it's been shattered in only a few days. And people are taking on not only the role of, declaring what side they're on, but of bringing this information to other people in their areas. So I think that what we're seeing is a continuous building of momentum. The slowdown that I think the White House hoped for and banked on around the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays is not happening. The cold weather is going on as usual, but people are still out. They're showing the images now, but we were in front of the New York Times in some bitter cold on Monday morning and stayed out there for a couple of hours with high energy. This is something that people really are very passionate about. They are very committed to, and it will be very interesting to see how this develops further. There certainly is no going back. This change is dramatic, it's significant, and it's going to have major implications for the way the White House is able to convince its own population of its policies.
Layan, there's two important figures, though I would say one is more important than the other in this case, that have actually mentioned these protests. One was the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, in the last speech he gave about a month ago now, maybe even a little bit more than a month ago. I've lost track of time. He specifically mentioned the protests in the West and how crucial they are to pushing for a ceasefire. It's almost like the protests in the West, I would say all around the world, but in the West specifically, in the US specifically, because this is America's war, really, the US can stop it tomorrow. Those protests are so crucial because it's in the belly of the beast. And then you also have, I think, much less important figure, but he's a figure nonetheless, Benjamin Netanyahu. But I'm just going to quote him. This was last week in the Financial Times. Benjamin Netanyahu, I'm just reading directly from it. Benjamin Netanyahu, at least in private, has been blunt about what Israel needs most to destroy Hamas: a steady supply of more U.S. bombs. Quote, "We need three things from the U.S. munitions, munitions, and munitions," the Israeli prime minister told a group of local government officials, according to a recording obtained by the Israel Today newspaper. "There are huge demonstrations in Western capitals," added Netanyahu, who is concerned political pressure overseas might threaten the U.S. arms shipments. "We need to apply counter pressure. There have been disagreements with the best of our friends." I think that is so important, that the leader of the country carrying out this genocide is concerned about these protests. And, I couldn't help but notice that he also mentioned we need countermeasures. So, being involved in organizing these, what do those countermeasures look like? I know we kind of talked about them the last time I had you on, but can you lay them out? And it doesn't seem like they're working.
Yeah, it does not actually seem like they're working. I think the strength of the popular momentum for this is really much stronger than the propaganda campaign coming from any Zionist institutions. There have been attempts since this latest wave, this latest surge in solidarity for Palestine, in the movement for solidarity for Palestine, to use scare tactics and other forms of repression fully announced by and backed by the state at all levels, to try to convince people that to come out for Palestine, to speak for Palestine, to organize and execute actions for the Palestine Solidarity Movement would in fact make you a terrorist, and that you need to be careful, you need to protect yourself. We saw many people getting fired from their jobs, many students are getting suspended or becoming under disciplinary investigations. We saw last week now, time is somewhat of a blur, but Congress kind of called this ridiculous circus of a hearing where they brought in very pro-Zionist university presidents and accused them of not being Zionist enough. And it was kind of like a very bizarre performance to try to put more pressure on their supposed allies to do better, because basically they're failing at repressing, in this case, the student movement, but I think overall, the general movement for Palestine. This billions of dollars in the propaganda machine for Israel is basically in a corner on the defensive. We have not been able to see any strong organized force coming out for Israel at all in the past couple of weeks, past 2 months, in the United States at least. So I think that this is, this is a frustration that Netanyahu has definitely expressed, and we take that quote as a victory. I mean, if he's feeling the heat, that means Biden is feeling the heat, and we know he is, that these mass mobilizations are having a very significant effect on what these heads of state feel that they can and cannot do. So for Netanyahu to not only admit that these are working and call for stronger forces to try to stop them, one, puts us on alert. We need to be very careful. We need to maintain maintain and build the momentum, which everyone is committed to doing. But two, should give a sense of accomplishment to everybody who has contributed to this growing movement for Palestine. It is certainly not insignificant that Netanyahu has said this. It's definitely not insignificant that Biden is very vocally trying to walk back his deep friendship with Netanyahu. He's, trying to disassociate himself from him. This is really a result of pressure from below.
Mm-hmm. Layan Fuleihan, organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me, and hopefully we see everyone at the next Shut It Down Day on December 16th.
Indeed, indeed.